We're in the final stretch of Pesach, which for the tzibur that learns Torah through the Agudas Yisrael is not just the final stretch of the Yontif of Pesach. It's much more than that. It's the final stretch of learning Hilchos Pesach, which started for many of us probably about 3-4 months ago. When we started Daf HaYomi about 4 months ago, Pesach the Pesachim, learning the Geschmack, the Sugis of the Gemara. In the middle, we had some Kachim Sugis all the way to the Arvei Pesachim Sugis. And then the Agudas Yisrael listened to the echoing cry of Klal Yisrael. We want to hear about the halachos now of Pesach. And for the last 2-3 weeks, 3 weeks already, even more, 4 weeks already, we've been learning the Hilchos Pesach. Last month, we've been learning Hilchos Pesach as the culmination of the Gemara, the Sugis. And now we're at the mamish, the end of the Seder. We're at the end of the Seder. And this is the Begeder, Ein Maftirin Achar Pesach Afikoimin. You teach him all the way, you teach him till Hilchos, all of Hilchos Pesach through the Afikoimin. So we're holding by the Afikoimin. Is there anything left? What's the Afikoimin? Once we know already the halachos of the matzahs, the halachos of the Seder, the halachos of Leila Seder, what can be left? What can we talk about today that's still Negea Pesach? And is somewhat Negea after Pesach, after the Seder. But we know that this is very, very, we're holding on. We're holding on to the halachos. You know, there was a Maisa with a certain fellow. He was went to boarding school to learn how to become. He was the son of a king. He was learning how to be a king. He was a prince. He went to boarding school and they taught him how to be a king. We'll call him Charles. No, this fellow Charles. So he became eventually the king. I don't know if it's Inzer or Charles, but he became the king eventually. This fellow Charles, when he became the king, he had a friend from the school named Paul. And Paul came one day to visit Charles. So when Paul came one day to visit Charles, so he comes in, Charles tells him, you see what I have over here? You see how much the people in my country love me and they hold of me and they care about me. So Paul tells him, listen, Charles, I don't know. I don't know if they love you. It could be. I walked in today and I saw by the gate, 2 guards, they had swords that went up to Shemayim. You know, it could be they do what you say and they listen to what you say, not because they love you. Maybe they listen to what you say because they're scared of you. I was even afraid to walk in. So Charles thinks for a minute. He says, you know, that's taka good aura. How are we going to figure out if they taka love me? So Paul says, look, I tell you like this, go and make some decrees, you know, maybe things that are actually even good for the people, but don't tell them a reason why, you know, maybe something medical or something, but just tell them they have to do it. Tell them a bunch of different decrees that they have to do. Send out letters that they have to do it at different times, interesting decrees. And don't threaten them. No threatening. So he sends out 3 decrees. He sends out 1 decree. This Friday comes, you have to have fish. Everybody in the country has to have fish at 12 o'clock. No matter what. Okay. The second decree, you have to take the king's flag on Sunday afternoon at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and you have to wave it around your head 10 times. Okay. Then the third decree is you have to take marbles and you have to put them on your head and you have to walk in a straight line. No, so Paul says, listen, Charles, if we see that they follow this, then we know for sure they love you. No question, then they love you. Nobody's threatening them and they're doing it, whether they do understand it, whether they don't understand it. Okay. So he sends out spies to find out what happened. The first spy comes back after, waiting on Friday at 12 o'clock. Friday, 12 o'clock, he comes back. He says, it's already nightfall. He says, you're not going to believe it. I was in 500 kilometers away from the kingdom, from the palace. And you should know, I was in a town and the whole place, at Ibig schmecked like a stiebel, it smelled like fish. The whole entire place smelled like fish. Fragnished. Everything was fish. So the king says to Paul, you see, they love me. You see this 500 kilometers away and everybody was eating fish. Okay, so Paul says, no, it's a raya, but it's not a raya. Let's see what happens with the flag. Then the next messenger, he comes in on Sunday night and he comes in, he says, yeah, you're not going to believe, he comes from 800 miles away. He says, I was there today, 800 miles away, and there was a full stadium. They rented out a whole stadium. And over there in that stadium, at exactly 12 o'clock, everybody picked up the flag together. There was like a parade, and they waved around the flag 10 times. It's okay. It's Kimat Raya. It's ready to fish. It smells of fish. They're waving around the flag. No, we get to the next day. He comes. He says, you know what? I was 1,000 miles away, 1,000 miles away. He said, today, you just saw rows and rows of people walking around the street with marbles on their head, walking straight lines and then falling off and putting them back on their head. So Paul says, look, it's a riot. It's a riot. They talk, I love you. It's a riot. They love you. They'll listen to whatever you have to say. And then in walks a messenger from over 2,000 miles away. 2,000 miles away walks in this messenger. And he says, King, you're not going to believe what I saw. You're not going to believe this. You know, this is already after all the other spies and the Meraglim. He says, what did you see? I tell you, I was 2,000 miles away. I was in a room, very, very big room. He says, this room had tables. This room has chairs. On one side of the table is one row of chairs. On the other side of the table is other chairs. He says, you have people of all ages and all stages of life. These guys are sitting on one side of the table. Those guys are sitting on the other side of the table. They have in their hand the decree of the king. And has these three things, the fish, the flag, and the marbles. And one fellow, he turns to, sometimes it was an 18-year-old boy, sometimes it was a 55-year-old man, sometimes it was an 80-year-old man, sometimes it was a 7-year-old child. And this one is looking at him and he says like this. He says, you know, the king says fish. What does he mean fish? Do you have to eat a live fish? He says, well, live fish, how could you say you have to eat a live fish? What, do you think the king would make us eat a live fish? Yeah, but maybe when it's a dead fish, it doesn't have a shame of a fish. So the other one says, well, and you mean that we might be able to eat a jellyfish? Nah, he says, no, that's not really, it doesn't have it's not a chefza of fish. And the other one says, no, what happens if you go outside and you take the flag when the king tells us to move around the flag? What happens if I stand outside and the wind moved the flag without me moving the flag? Is that called that the flag moved? Is that called I moved the flag? Am I yoytze moving the flag? So one side, what are you talking about? That's not called you move the flag. You need the koyach adam to move the flag. And the other one says, nah, what are you talking about? You're harnessing the koyach. Of course, that's called you're moving the flag. And the other fellow says, what happens if I'm walking down the street, I have the marbles on my head, and I take, one walk and the marble falls off. So now once the marble falls off, is it a poiter? Is it a poiter? The marble fell off and now I don't have to do it again. The other fellow says, what are you talking about? It's not a poiter. It's a din. You have to walk a straight line with marbles. And the other fellow says, what do you mean? You have to put the marbles on the head and you have to walk. And I did that. So the king says, you see over here, that's the real show that these guys love me more than anybody else. These guys, they're 2,000 miles away. And not only are they doing what the king says, but all they want to do is talk about what the king says. All they want to do is try to figure out what the king wants and to make the king happy. Is the Nimshal Bayas Rabbi Isai is clear. We're 2,000 miles away. We're 2,000 years away, Rabbi Isai. And us, all we could do to think of what could we do in a matziv, even when Klal Yisrael had tzaras this year, whether it's in our yontif, whether it's our simchas yontif, all we can do is figure out what is the Rebbeinu Shel Olam's ratzon in this halacha and that shaila. What makes the Rebbeinu Shel Olam happy? What will give him simcha? Talking about this, what does he really want? And that's what we do 2,000 miles away, 2,000 years away. No shaila Rabbi Isai that those people, they become the trusty sarim and the trusty generals of the king's army. There's no shaila Rabbi Isai that what we're doing today in the Afikoimen and learning the halachas of Pesach, even at the end, even in the last stretch, in the final stretch, trying to figure out what is it that wants the Rebbeinu Shel Olam, what does the Rebbeinu Shel Olam want in Hilchos Pesach? So ein maftir nach Afikoimen ataem or loy from the Hilchos Pesach. Let's today see some of the nirtzer Rabbi Isai, some of the geschmack, the shailas that come up now at the end of Pesach, which are negeya after Pesach. And then in Yetz Hashem, maybe if we have time, maybe we'll do mamish some Chad Gadi over here. Maybe a few shilas for the Chag if there's time, a few riddles, a few geschmacke shilas that the Olam could have together when they zetzach zazamin mit the zevach mishpocha, Bez Hashem. So let's see together what we have over here. I'll just whet your appetite with a little bit of karpas. A little karpas. Somebody called me yesterday with a shaila, which to answer him is a riddle. It's a very interesting shaila. It's a karpas, Rabbi said. It's not what we're supposed to talk about, but the karpas is the echetimtza for the enjoyment of the rest of the Suda. Somebody called me with a shaila, which I'll start out as a riddle. How do you have a case of where someone is over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimotze, but mitzad sheni, he's not able to sell it? He has an item that he's over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimotze, and he's not able to sell it. And he's probably not even able to do bittul on the item. And the only answer to do is to burn it. Where do you have such a case? Why should I be over on Bayirah? So some people would say maybe it means that the case is that he has the achrayis of a goyish chametz, but that's not so pashut that he can't sell that. It's possible that he would be able to sell that. The case is a shaila that I got yesterday. Someone called me. He told me that he sold chametz with me, and that he realizes that in the freezer that he sold, he has all the challah that he took off all the year. His wife took off challah the whole year, and he, never burnt it. He figures he'll burn it with the chametz. He forgot to burn it. And where is it? Now it's in a freezer somewhere, freezing away over there. And the freezer that was sold, there's chametz in that freezer, and he sold the whole chametz. And he asked me, am I allowed to sell that chametz? What's the shaila? The shaila is, what's that challah that he took off the whole year? That challah that he took off during the course of every Friday, every Shabbos, every Erev Shabbos, that challah is truma tmeya. Truma tmeya is not yours. You don't own it. So you think, okay, so if I don't own the truma tmeya, so then what could be the problem? I'm not over in Bayirah. It's not mine. It's Shevet HaKoyin. So it's not my problem. And maybe he can't sell it because it's not his money to sell. But in Mitzad Sheni, even if he does, he doesn't need to sell it. It's not his. Says the Mishnah Berurah, based on a Gemara that the Olam over here, the Olam that learned Daf Yomi just learned about 2 months ago, maybe 9 days ago, maybe 67 days ago. Over there, the Gemara talks about a very, very interesting sugya. The Gemara talks about when a person is making matzah on Pesach and he has challah, what do we do with the challah? Because we can't bake it because we have no right to bake it because we have nobody to give it to. But mitzad sheni, it's going to turn into chametz. So what do we do with it? That's the sugya of the Gemara. Says the Mishnah Berurah, an explanation of that Gemara. The Mishnah Berurah is in Taf Nun Zayin. I think it was in Sif Kotin. Let's see, I saw this yesterday. I think it was in Sif Kotin Tes Vav. The Mishnah Berurah says, you're over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzeh if this becomes chametz. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why am I over on Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzeh? It's like the Mishnah Berurah, the afagav that it's hektish ve'ein shalai, it's not yours. It's truma. Says the Mishnah Berurah, mikol makoim over Bal Yirah. You're still over on Bal Yirah. Why? Zak the Mishnah Berurah, hoyel v'iboy mitchell alive evichule, because you can be shoyel on this chametz. You have the ability to be shoyel on the chametz. You could go and get 3 people, and they'll be matter it for you. They'll say that the whole idea of what truma is it's like a neder. So you have the ability to go in front of 3 people and say, I don't want it to be chala, truma. And then it would lemafreya turn into not mamin koyin, and it would be yours. So the mela in this case, you have a very unique situation. Everybody said, this is your karpas. This is the introduction to your seder. You have here a situation of where I'm over in Bayirah Bayimatzeh because I have a certain ownership in this, because I could theoretically be shoyel in it and turn it into my item, mitzad echad. Mitzad sheni, that's enough to make it in my rishus. But who says you have the ability to sell that? It's mammon HaKoyin. You don't have the ability, perhaps, to sell such a thing. I don't have the ability to sell something which isn't mine. I don't know if you can be allowed to sell truma tmeya to a guy. So l'chayra, in this case, I told him l'chayra, he has to burn it miyad. He has to go and stop whatever he's doing, and he has to burn it miyad because he couldn't sell it, and he's being over on Bal Yirah Bayimatzeh. Now the Maisa, I saw afterward. That's what it says in the Mishnah Berurah. I saw afterward there's a Chok Yaakov. Chok Yaakov is in Tov Mem Daled. That's the sugya of Hilchos Erev Pesach Shechal B'Yos B'Shabbos that we know very well from this year. The Chok Yaakov over there, he seems to. Chok Yaakov was the Shvus Yaakov. He was one of the great Hapoiskim. He seems to say not like this. He seems to say, he's not arguing on the Gemara, but he seems to say that's only ad kama that you didn't already in the course of the rest of the year eat the bread, eat the challah. But now, once you've eaten the challah, which is the case over here, you're not allowed to be shoyel anymore. Because if you shoyel, it'll come out limafreya that you were over on an isser when you ate it. So it could be that you don't have the ability to be shoyel, and therefore you're talking not over on Bal Yirah Bayimatzeh. So this is something to think about. But that's the karpas. Now let's get to the sugyas that we said we get to today. And the first sugya is, which is Nagay, I'd say in the Moitzei Pesach, is the oilam over here. Some of them sold chametz. Most people go to a Rav, even if he doesn't have chametz gomer to sell, but he wants to go to the Rav. He also wants to give a little some matana to the Rav. So he sells the chametz or any potential chametz. He doesn't want to have any shilas. No, you go to the Rav, and in the shtar, So then a lot of times you have like a room, if it's a room that you don't want to look into, you don't want to be baidik, and you just want to sell and not to have to think about that room. Some people have a garage, they don't want to sell. Some in Eretz Yisrael, you have a machsan or whatever. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. You have that room, an Erev Pesach, we just had enough, and just start throwing things in there, throw this, throw this, throw that. And then somebody says, did anybody see Yankel? Whoops, take him out of the room. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. So you have that room you sell to the guy, and that room belongs to the guy. Erev Pesach. Some people lock up the whole entire house, and I don't know if it's the guy you, but some people lock up the house, and they even go all the way to Florida. No, so you lock up the house, you sell the whole entire house. Now got a big shiloh over here, very big shiloh. So people know the other shiloh. What do you do about b'dikas chametz? That's a shiloh for the beginning of Pesach. We're at the end of Pesach. Comes Mitzvah Pesach, and now you bought back your house. You get back your house. Gevaldik, you come into your house. Your house was used to be owned by a guy, and now it's Jewish-owned property. Abaisai, maybe you have to go over to that room or rooms or all the rooms that were owned by the goyim, and you have to reaffix the mezuzah. Why would I have to reaffix the mezuzah? Because Abaisai, there's halacha in Hilchos mezuzah that says you're not allowed to make, we know there's a concept by Hilchos tzitzis, by Hilchos sukkah in general, of taseh v'loy min ha'asui. You have to do a mais asiyah to be putting on the mezuzah. And not that the mezuzah, like by sukkah or by tzitzis, just happens to be there. It has to be that you affix it when there's a chiyuv. Now, in this case over here, it's a very unique situation. It says the Shach, for example, in Yeridea and Siman Reish Pei Vav and Sivkot and Chav Hei, there are some shitas that hold that you can only put a mezuzah on a door way that has a door. Shitas Rambam. Okay, we put on without a bracha if it doesn't have a door in the doorway. But there are shitas that hold that the only time you put a mezuzah on a doorway is when it has a door. Okay, says the Shach, don't go and put on a mezuzah before you put on the door, because then the mezuzah is going to be there memela, and that's tasif v'lo min asui. Says the Shach, put on the door and then put on the mezuzah. Says the Shach, what happens if you had a doorway you weren't ready to put up? You had a door. Okay, so what do? You put up the mezuzah. Okay, says the Shach, when now you put on the door a month later or 2 months later, says the Shach, take off the mezuzah and reaffix the mezuzah that it shouldn't be tasif v'lo min ha'asui. So that's a concept that exists in Hilchos mezuzah. It's true the Sdei Chemed asked the question, where do we know that it comes from? HaRav, when it comes to tzitzis, it says vasulachem tzitzis. So there's an asiyah when it comes to tzitzis. That's why there's a din of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. When it comes to sukkah, it says sukkahs taseh lachem, says the Sdei Chemed in Kuf Yud Gimel. That's why oismem. That's why there's a din of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. But how do we know by mezuzah there's a din of taseh v'lo min ha'asui? Okay, what can I do? Rabbi Say it's a Gemara Mefresh in Menachos and Daf Lamed Gimel that says there's a din of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. So you have to have a munah. There is a din, the Kiryat Sefer says maybe it's only the Rabbanon, but there is a din of taseh v'lo min ha'asui by mezuzah. Skrada Shaila, the Har Tzvi, he says, let's say a person puts on his tefillin, some of us are on Chol Hamoed, some of us after Chol Hamoed, he puts on his tefillin and it gets caught in the shirt. So what does he do? He pulls out the shirt. Pulls out the shirt because it was a chatzitza. Everybody knows if you do that, you don't make another bracha. Why? Taseh v'lo min ha'asui. It wasn't on my hand. Bikashris, it just memela went onto my hand. So by tefillin, says the Har Tzvi, we don't say taseh v'lo min ha'asui. So why by mezuzah we do? Great question, not our sugya, but that's la halacha. The halacha is there's a din of taseh v'lo min ha'asui when it comes to mezuzah. Listen to us, Shaila Rabbi Say. Now we have a married Shaila. Kumtz again, this guy bought is a guy chayiv in mezuzah, Rabbi Say? Definitely not. No, comes again. This guy, he owns your apartment. He owns your room, your bedroom, your everything room. I don't know what. He owned your room for the last 8 days. Now, there was a mezuzah on all those 8 days. Nobody took off that mezuzah. Now you come to your house, you come back to your room on Matzah Pesach, and you have this room. Now you own this room. Rabbi Say, I move into a house. I find out that the guy, he put up mezuzahs. Why the guy put up mezuzahs? He found out that there was like a tremendous skula. Reminds me of the story, Rabbi Say. Once there was a builder there, the painter. The rabbi came afterward. He says, hey, I forgot to take down the mezuzahs. The painter says, don't worry, Rabbi, I know the Jewish people already. I know you're supposed to take down the mezuzah and you put it back on. He says, I don't even need the instructions. I take out the instructions and I threw them in the garbage. So this fellow, you bought a goyish house and he has mezuzahs there. L'chayra, you have to take it down. You have to put up a mezuzah. Even that's a shtickle shayla. But l'chayra, you can't just be saimich that there are mezuzahs there because it's tasav leimin also. You have to put it on when it's chayiv. So what's the difference? Over here also, the 8 days of Pesach, there was mezuzahs on the wall, on the door, that were biptur. They weren't chayiv. These mezuzahs weren't necessary. Now comes Motzei Pesach. On Motzei Pesach, so now, do I have to take down the mezuzah and put it back? What are you going to say? Well, there's a mezuzah there, but it was ptur. It was there in a situation of ptur. I should have to take down the mezuzah and I should have to put it back up. Elamai, what are you going to say? You're going to say, nah, the mechira, it's not really real. Don't go down that route. Oh, no way. Chaz v'shalom. This mechira is very, very real. And I don't even understand the shaila. Why is the mechira not real? Is there anybody who the guy Rabbi has to pay an exorbitant amount for your chametz and for your items? It's not the pshat that he gets off scot-free and we just say, here, buy it, and we give it to you for free. If the guy would like to take the chametz, we'll tell him gesundheit, and he's going to have to pay us for it. As a matter of fact, right now, anybody who sold chametz, he sold the guy that I dealt with, he bought 190 million shekel worth of chametz. No, so no problem. If he wants to cut, he owes me now. This guy owes me. I was the shliach on behalf of my people, so he owes me 190 million shekel. No problem. If he comes and says, I'm taka doing it, I'm saying, no problem. Now pay the money. He owns it already. He has a debt now of 190 million shekel. If Motzei Pesach comes and he doesn't give me back my 190 million shekel that he owes me, I'm going to start being goy for the chayv. I'm going to start being taking over this chayv. So Mamela, this is what the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and the Lechem Aponim brings down. He says, in Maskira Loi, if you rent out your house to a guy, L'chayret Sarchi and Cotton, he's talking about if you rent it to him on Pesach. He says a lashon there. And Avada, we all understand, it's even renting to the guy, because we know that mezuzah, like the Olim learned in Pesachim Daf Daled, that renting is a chayvus adar. Mezuzah is a chayvus adar. It's a chiyuv on the one that's living there. So who has been officially the owner of this dira for the last 8 days? The guy. So has it been chayiv in the last 8 days? Absolutely not. Comes along the lechem upon him, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and he says, "L'chayra tasa v'loy mina asi kol shekain." If you sold it to the guy, and l'chayra, when you buy it back michadash after Pesach, it's a tasa v'loy mina asi. He says, "Ayin in the Shar Tshuva Tavreish Chavav Siv Zayin v'hu adin lekan." I saw this in the Shar Tzion. Rechaim Kanievsky has a sefer called Mezuzah is Beisecha. He wanted to call it Mishnah Brura because he wrote a Mishnah Brura on Hilchos Mezuzah. And his father, the Steipler, told him, no, don't call it Mishnah Brura. Mishnah Brura is for the Sefer the Chavetz Chaim. So he called it Mezuzah's Beisecha. It would have the same Rosh Tevis Mem Beis. So in Shar Tzion Kuf Mem Gimel, he says, Ayin lechem aponim, mitzvah l'shmoyel l'divrei chachamim. It's a mitzvah to listen to Chaim Kanievsky. So we just listened to him. We looked into the lechem aponim. In the lechem aponim, he brings down that if you sold your house or rented your house to a guy, so then on Motzei Pesach you have to take off the mezuzah and you have to reaffix the mezuzah. But Rabbi Isai, it's not the minig. Das is not the minig, Rabbi Isai. What's the pshat? So let's try to understand today, Rabbi Isai. I'm talking now purely, let's have Simchas Yontif a little bit. I'm talking to an oilam of Talmidei Chachamim. I know you want a Gishmak Chakira, and you wanted to come out Halacha L'maisa. You guys aren't going to suffice mit a bissel karpas. You want a bissel ganze matzah over here. You want a Shulchan Aruch over here. So let me tell you, Rabbi Isai, Gishmak Chakira, and tell me if it has a shaychus. Let's try to understand a different side. Now, Rabbi Isai, there's another shayla, which is a very Gishmak shayla in mezuzah, which we're going to come back to Hilchos Pesach in a moment. But there's a very geshmak shayla in Hilchos mezuzah in general. What's a shayla? Shayla is what happens. You have a yid. We know that when a person, let's say, he rents a dira. He rents a dira. The halacha is, if you rent a dira, so for the first, at least in Chutz La'aretz, where I think most of my tzibur is, if you rent a dira, so for the first 30 days, excuse me, for the first 30 days, when you rent a dira in Chutz La'aretz, you're patur from mezuzah. That's the halacha. When you rent a dira in Chutz La'aretz for the first 30 days, you're patur from a mezuzah. Okay. Now, after 30 days, you're chayiv in a mezuzah. Okay, if you're renting, you might not be chayiv min Torah. Okay, but you're chayiv in a mezuzah. So you have a person, he's renting a house. Now, he's chayiv in a mezuzah. The first 30 days, he's patur from mezuzah. Now, I must tell you, Rabbi Yisai, this is a very big sugya. Some shittas hold that you're only chayiv, you're only patur in the mezuzah if you don't have a contract for a year and things like that and whatever. I can't go into the sugi now, but there certainly is a Shulchan Aruch, Mefareshes, in Reish Pei Vav and Chav Beis, that there is a case of where a person rents an apartment, a house for 30 days and he's parted from mezuzah. There certainly is a sugi like that. And then after 30 days, you become chayiv in mezuzah, maybe midrabanan, maybe deraisa. There's a Rav Moshe about this, there's a Rabbi Akiva Eiger about this. Okay. Now, what happens, says the Minchas Chinuch, very, very interesting. The Minchas Chinuch is usually very, very mayrich. Here he's very mekatzer. In the 424th simon over there, the Minchas Chinuch has a shayla like this. He has a shayla. What happens? Somebody is renting an apartment for the first 30 days, and he puts up a mezuzah. That's very normal. Many people do that. They put up a mezuzah even when they're pater. He puts up a mezuzah. Comes day 31, says the Minchas Chinuch, wait a minute. But now, shouldn't I have to take off the mezuzah, take it off, and reaffix it? Why? Says the Minchas Chinuch, it's tasav elimin asi. The first 30 days that I had the mezuzah on, I was pater, I'm not chayiv, and now the mezuzah is there, but it wasn't put on in a situation when I was chayiv. It wasn't put on in a matzav of chayiv. So says the Minchas Chinuch, why shouldn't I have to take down the mezuzah and put it up again, reaffix it? Now, I think most of us know that's not the minig. Most of us know that there are people, they rent a dira, they'll put it on immediately when they come in. It's even a shayla how immediately, but they'll put on the mezuzah, comes day 30, and it's on, and they leave it, and they go further, and that's it. What happened to Tasav V'Lo Mina Asui? So the Minchas Chinuch is very, very mekatzer, not like his style. He's very mekatzer, and he just says to you a couple of words. He says, well, Ayin in the Pri Megadim in Hilchos Tzitzis, and whatever he says there, it's the same thing over here. What does he say there? So the Pri Megadim over there tells us a big aside. What happens if a person makes tzitzis at night? So according to the shitas that hold that you're not allowed to make tzitzis, that you're not chayiv in tzitzis at night. So if you make tzitzis at night, why don't we say it's tasav v'lo mina asri? You made the tzitzis in a zman that they're not chayiv. So why don't we say it's tasav v'lo mina asri? Says the Pri Megadim. You know why? Because the zman is memela ka'asi. The zman just comes on its own. What do I mean? This man comes on its own. The tzitzis you made properly. Elamai, it's not a zman of tzitzis. No, it's mechusar zman, like the Gemara says in Pesachim. It's on its way. The zman is coming. Nothing has to happen except for the zman to come. That's not a problem of tasav v'lo mina asi. Says the Minchas Chinuch. It's the same thing here. I rent an apartment. The first 30 days, I'm pater from the mitzvah of mezuzah, but I put it on in P'tur. Why isn't that tasav v'lo mina asi when I hit day 31? Because the zman is memela ka'asi. The zman comes on its own. The zman comes memela, and therefore that's not a chesaron. The only time there's a chesaron of tasav v'lo mina asi is when there's a problem in my asiya, my maisa. No, here the zman comes on its own. That's the words of the Minchas Chinuch. Now, Paisa, I'm going to tell you a davar nifla. Davar nifla. Comes again the Marshag, the great Hungarian tshuva writer, over 100 years ago, 120 years ago, Shai Greenfield, and he writes in Beis Ayin Daled, he talks about this Minchas Chinuch, he talks about this Pri Megadim, excuse me, and he says, I don't know if you have to say what the Pri Megadim says. I have a much simpler reason to tell you. Everything here is complicated, but he feels he has a simpler reason. Why is it that you can make tzitzis at night, and it's not a problem of tasav v'lo mina asi? Listen to davar nifla, davar beautiful. He says, what? Hayitachin, an oinen, Rachmana litzlan, someone that's an oinen. Are you telling me, says the Marshag, that in oinen, he hasn't yet buried his nifter? Are you telling me that if he makes tzitzis, it's a problem of tasav v'lo mina asi? Now, I don't know why he took on so pashut, but that's what he says. He says, are you telling me that's not a problem? He says, it's not zman memela ka'asi. It's not something that just the zman is going to come. There you have to do an action. You have to bury the mace. So then he says, nobody's going to say that if you make tzitzis when you're in oinen, when a person's in oinen, that's not going to be, that's going to be a psul of tasav v'lo mina asi. He says, I'm going to tell you a different shot. Do you know why it's not tasav v'lo mina asi if you make tzitzis at night? Says the Marshag, beautiful. Zok the Marshag, when you make tzitzis at night, it's not tasav v'lo mina asi because it's not felt in the asiya. It's not a problem in the asiya. Listen to Rabbi Yisai. This is not just some weird chakira, is the balker under the hat? Is the hat over the balker? Let me explain to you, Rabbi Yisai. He's saying it's not the pshat that the zman just comes memela. And that's why tzitzis is mutter, because, the zman is just going to come, the daytime is going to come. He says over here, there's no chisaron, tasev eloy min ha'asui, is when there's a problem in your asiyah. He says over here, there's no problem in the chayfetz, in the tzitzis I'm making. There's no problem in my asiyah. My asiyah is on a beged. This beged is chayiv. There's something zaitig, something stadi, something from the side. What's it? That it's not yet the time. That's not in the chayfetz. So nothing is lacking in my asiyah. Let's regroup. So by the oinin, says the Marshag, by the oining, there's nothing lacking in the beged in the tzitzis. If he makes the tzitzis, the beged is wonderful beged. The strings are wonderful strings. He's making it, it's chayiv, everything good. Elamai, he's potter because he's an oinin. So he's potter, but that's not in the chayfetz. So it's not lacking in the asiyah. Has to be, there's a problem in your asiyah. There's a problem in the chayfetz. I'm going to tell you a davar nifla. There's a simchas yantiv. Your yotzei right now, simchas yantiv, according to all the shittas. No shayla, Rabbi Isai. Listen to a davar nifla. The mela, go back to our case. Our case was you have a person that he moved into a dira. He's renting the dira. The first 30 days he puts on a mezuzah, even though he's potter. It's a rented dira. Comes day 31, does he have to take off the mezuzah and put it back on? So let's see, now we have two reasons why not. Reason number one is because the zman is memela kasi. Day 31 is just going to come on its own. So if day 31 is going to come on its own, it wasn't a problem in the asiyah, in the tassel, no tassel benelsi problem. Now you have another reason why. And this also would work because it wasn't lacking in the asiyah. When I put up the mezuzah, I put it up onto a room, which beside the room is the right qualification, it's the right size, it's the right doorway, it has a door, everything. Elamai, it's not a problem in the asiyah. It's a problem in my chiyuv. I'm only a renter. Okay. So then the first 30 days, you're not chayiv, but it's not a problem in the chayfetz. This is a chayfetz, which tasav and asi is when there's a problem in the item, the chayfetz. What's the nafkamina? Listen to davar nifla. What happens? You rent an apartment. You rent an apartment. You're living there 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever. After a while, your wife turns to you and she says to you, actually, you turn to your wife. And you tell her, it's a shut of the geld. We're throwing all this money in the garbage. Where I come from, in the East River, you're throwing all this money in the East River. Why don't we just buy this place already instead of putting, into the slot machine over here? So you decide to buy the dira, to buy the house that you've been renting. Okay. Now, Paisai, when you rent a house, many Rishonim paskin, Rabbi Kiva Eger says like this, many Paiskin paskin, that you are not chayiv in mezuzah min ha-Torah. When you rent a house, you're only chayiv mezuzah according to many shitas, midrabanan. Paisai, I buy the house now. Now I'm chayiv in mezuzah min ha-Torah. Till now, I was not chayiv min ha-Torah. So the Achrayim all talk about, the Karen Oira discusses, the Karen Oira is in Menachas and Daf Mem Dalid. So then the Chayra, is this a problem of Tasev Eloy Min Ha'asi? I've been renting a dira, I was only chayiv midrabanan. Now I buy this dira, so now I should be chayiv min ha-Torah. Now, Rabbi, I'm sure I'm talking to people, some of who have actually, the house that they were renting, they probably bought. Did you go and take down your mezuzah and then reaffix it? So I think the meaning is most people do not do that. Even the people that were renting, they don't. Why? So lefi what we just said, it's totally in these two tzadim. If you learn that the lumdis of why it wasn't tasev eloy min ha'asi was like the minchas chinuch and the pri megadim, because zman memela ka'asi, it just comes on its own. So then, over here, it's not coming on its own. You have to go and do a maisa. You have to go and, it's a avada, you have to go and do something. You have to go and buy the house. Till now, you're renting the house. You're on chayiv midrabanan. And it's not going to just come that you're going to be chayiv. You have to go and buy it. So you have to do something. According to that side, it would, yes, be a problem tasav eloy asi. But we know that the minig olam is not like that. The minig must be going like the marshag, that this is not called tasav eloy min ha'asi, because here it's not a problem mitzad the chayfetz of the house. The house is a house which is requiring a mitzvah. It has doors, it has walls, it has the right dimensions, it has a roof. So that's not a problem in the asiyah. There was nothing wrong with my asiyah. Elamai, the chiyuv came min hatzad. I didn't own it yet. That's not a problem in tasav eloy min ha'asi. As I bezai, all those types, and I'm seeing a lot of questions over here. All those questions, a cotton, etc., they're all zaitig. It's not a chesaron mitzad the chayfetz. It's a bezai. Listen to a davar nifla. So now, bezai, and who paskins like this? Rav Chaim Kanievsky, in his Sefer Mezuzas Beisecha, he brings down a davar nifla. He brings down that in the first, Rav Chaim Kanievsky rewrote or had 7 maduras of the Sefer Mezuzas Beisecha. In the first 6 maduras, he brings this shaila of where a person rented a dira and then he bought his rented dira. And he says in the first 6 maduras, the first 6 versions, he says, yeah, in that case, it was tasav eliminasi. You have to take it down and you have to put it back up because tasav eliminasi. In the 7th madura, Chaim Kanievsky brings down a Nachlas Tzvi, that the Nachlas Tzvi Taka says, not like this. And he says, Chaim Kanievsky says, he seems to have been Chayzer. Chaim Kanievsky seems to be Chayzer in the 7th time that he wrote this. I mean, the first time he wrote this was over 70 years ago, Rabbi Isai. He wrote it 70 years ago. He was a young Bocher, Kimat 18, 19, 20 years old. But he wrote this, when he wrote it, the first 60 years, he held that you have to reaffix it with a bracha. But now he holds you don't have to reaffix it. Why? Because it's not tasav elimin asi, because it was originally made b'kashris. Since it was originally made b'kashris, and the psul of having only been a renter is not in the asiya. Your asiya was a good asiya. I come back to our shaila. You put up your mezuzah months ago, years ago, in a house that was chayiv. And the house was mitzad the chayfetz, was a chayfetz that's chayiv in mezuzah. And you put it up at kashrus and it had the right dimensions. There were 8 days now that the guy owned it. And the guy has now, that's it's pater. Calls man that the guy's living there, the guy owns it. That's a ptur. Okay. But that doesn't make it that the asiya that you did wasn't the kosher asiya. You have to buy back your house. Who cares? Who cares if it comes memela or not? It's not lacking in the chayfetz. It's a kasher asiya. The asiya of the mezuzah was put up in kashrus, and the bezai, that's not tasav elimin asi. So therefore, the minig ha'olam is miyushiv. Now I did see that the oile shurin, he brings down from the goyin Rav Moshe Feinstein in Beis in Reish Ches. He brings down over there that he asked his child Rav Moshe, do you have to reaffix the mezuzah after Pesach? And Rav Moshe said no. You don't. Now, it's interesting. Rav Moshe there seems to say another reason why you don't have to. Rav Moshe seems, and it's a it's one sentence, and it was something that he heard from Rav Moshe, so it's a little bit hard to be medayik. He seems to maybe even be referring to what we said, but then he also says something else, Rav Moshe. He says also in the shtar allows a person to have drisas regal. If a person forgot something in the room, the guy understands that he might go in, and you do have some type of a kinyan in there. So therefore, it could be that it's not in ganzen potter. It could be it's not in ganzen that you don't have rights in that room, but that's a big chiddush, Rabbi Isai, because who says those rights would be mechayev me in a mezuzah? But that's what Rav Moshe seems to say. But la'alocha l'maisa, Rav Moshe agrees anyways, that you do not have to reaffix the mezuzah. So that's shaila number 1, negeya, at the end of Pesach. If you went and sold your room, you do not need to reaffix the mezuzah. Okay, it's a good thing we don't need to reaffix the mezuzah, because we're going to have a lot of tefillas kalim to do on Motzei Pesach. Now, I don't mean, Rabbi Isai, the tefillas kalim, anybody who last year had certain kulas because of COVID, that he wasn't able to get to a mikvah and he sold it to a guy and this and that. So this year, you're not supposed to be soymech on those kulas, really, and you're actually supposed to go and be toivel these items. I don't mean that. I mean, we have the next shaila. What's the next shaila? The next shaila is anybody who sold his chametz on Erev Pesach. So what happens if he writes in the shtar, I'm just, that closet over there with all of my china and all of my forks and my knives and my spoons, my glasses and my this, I don't want to think about it on Pesach. And he goes and he sells the pots and pans and everything and this and that. Okay, it was owned by a guy, Rabbi Isai. Any keli that's owned by a guy, any kli achila suda was owned by a guy at any step of the way. If it was manufactured by a guy, the owner was a guy, and then he sold it to a Jew and you buy it by a Jew, but at one point it was owned by a guy, you have to be toivel it. So now we go to the second shaila. Motzei Pesach, I don't have to reaffix all the mezuzahs in my house. That's very good because I'm going to be at the Keilim mikvah all night. Because now there's a story with the Chazon Ish. The story with the Chazon Ish was that the Chazon Ish, one year, accidentally, I say accidentally, you'll see why in a moment, sold to the guy his kalim. Motzei Pesach, the Chazon Ish said, okay, that's it. It was owned by the guy, so now he has to go and retoivel all his kalim. Now, Boisai, when you hear this, this is unbelievable. The Chazon Ish is saying, Davar Pasha, don't go and sell your kalim. Who asked you to sell your kalim bichlal? Because Lamaisa, it says in Shulchan Aruch that as long as your kalim are clean, you're not over on Belias of Bal Yirah Bal Yimotzei. You're not over on, once your kalim are clean, you're only over on Bal Yirah Bal Yimotzei of Ben. So most people, they clean their kalim out of Erev Pesach anyways. So there's no need to sell it. There's no need to sell it. And you don't need, and Elamai, you're afraid maybe you missed something. So you sell the chametz, which is on the kalim, but you don't sell the actual kalim. 1 year, the Chazon Ish, quote unquote, messed up, and the Chazon Ish accidentally sold the kalim. So in that year, the Chazon Ish Motzei Pesach went and toiveled all the kalim. So l'chayra, if anybody here messed up, a lot of our shtaris, they already took care of this, and they write that we're selling the chametz, which is on the kli, and we're not selling the actual kli. But a lot of times people, they come with lists. I sell chametz, and people bring me the lists, and I'll see on the list, and the guy will say he's selling his pots, he's selling his pans, he's selling his forks, he's selling his knives, he's selling his wife, he's selling everything, right? The teenagers, tazicher. And so now the shaila is that, does he have to go to the mikvah on Motzei Pesach and toivel all of the kalim? Now, I just want to tell you one thing, Rabbi Isai. I was mevarer the story with the Chazon Ish. I was mevarer the story with the Chazon Ish a little bit. And usually the Chazon Ish was makbid to write the kalim that were, the chametz that was dovik to the kalim, because the Chazon Ish held of this problem. Right. 1 year, the Chazon Ish, when I was mevaret with the mishpacha, they told me the Chazon Ish forgot to write that or to say it to the Rav or whatever. And the Chazon Ish went to the mikvah and Motzei Pesach and toiveled all his kalim. So I said to the nephew who told me the story, the great nephew, I told him, the Chazon Ish went to the mikvah and toiveled all the kalim. It's like an unbelievable thing, right? He said to me, "Was meinst du zugen? Du meinst that the Chazon Ish hat da sehr viel Sachen? What do you think the Chazon Ish had? Motzei Pesach, he went to the mikveh with a bzekel. He had like a little baggie, Rabbi Isai. He had a leffel and gahat epis, like a fork, a teller. He had a plate. He had a glass. He had one spoon, one fork, one bowl, one cup. No, was sehr gefährlich, right? So when you hear that, now you got to get really nervous. Everybody said, no, the Chazon Ish was able to be machmer like this, to go and toivel all the kalim. But us, we're going to have to go Motzei Pesach. We're going to have to get a rider truck of Einlach. No, so I say, what's Lamaisa? Do we have to be machmer on this? So this is a very interesting shaila. The Pitzchei Tshuva in Sivkot Chav Aleph, over there in Siman Kov Chav, at Hilchos Tfilas Kalim, he brings a Chachmas Adam, Abin Yinsiyan, that say, Taka, don't sell the kalim. Don't sell the kalim. And if you did sell the kalim to the guy, you have to toivel them. The Darkei Tshuva and Sivkot and Sadi brings an ansei lavaina. He says, don't sell the kalim. And if you did, you have to retoivel them. He says, maybe not with a bracha. He says, why not with a bracha? He says, well, maybe it's somewhat of a haramar mechira. Okay, we don't want to say that very loud. But he says, no, so don't retoivel with a bracha. There are Shulchan in Siman Kov Chaf. He says, I heard there are machmirim, but I don't agree. Now he says over there, interesting thing, it's a hard thing to read. He says, we do it because of the chumrah of Pesach. That's why we sell in the first place. And that's why we're not saimach on the bittul. He says, but we know it's coming back to us, these kalim, and therefore it doesn't get the shame of the kuti alav. It doesn't get the shame of the goy on these kalim. Now I have a hard time understanding the Aruch HaShulchan, because shame goy alav is a siba that is going to make me chayiv in tfilas kalim. Over here, to say that the guy's name isn't on it, but the guy actually owns it. Ani mamin b'emunah shleima that the guy owns the chametz. I hope so. I'm the guy that sold it for everybody. So I don't know. I'm not so thrilled about this. I saw that the Chalkis bin Yamin in Siman Kuf Chaf, in Zivkot and Sadi Hay, he taka brings down that you have to toivel it without a bracha. He brings it loch l'maisa. Tichsim Sefer in Siman Kuf Yadalid, he brings down from his Rebbe, Rav Nosson Alder, used to warn that a person should not sell the actual kli, should only sell the chametz on the kli. So, l'maisa, this is a very, very serious shaila. The Aruch HaShulchan saying that the guy doesn't have a shlita on the item. It's a very big chiddush. Rabbi say, saif, if a guy owns it at any shlav, so then the din of tfilas kalim is like the Rishonim, like the Yerushalmi says, you have to take it out of Tumas HaAkum and bring it into Kedushas Yisrael, like a gerus. So over here also, why shouldn't you have to toivel it? And most poskim seem to say you have to toivel it. The only thing I could tell you is what I saw in the Tshuva by Rav Elyashiv And what I myself heard from Rav Elyashiv was, let's say in the case I just mentioned, my shtar, for example, says explicitly that I'm selling only the chametz hadovik on the kli, and I'm not selling the kli because there's no need to sell a kli because the blias you're not over on. Now I have people, they write me Gantz and Megillas over here, and the guy's selling this and this. Now in it, he might write that he's also selling his pots and his pans and his whatever. So maybe he'll say that supersedes, and I have to call him back and tell him, you should know that you have to go and toivel it on Motzei Shabbos and Motzei Yontif in the mikveh. That I heard from Rav Elyashiv, that I'm a shliach for him, for his benefit. And this is certainly not his benefit to be doing this, because he's not going to toivel it on Motzei Yontif. So I am not doing that. I'm not doing a shlichus on that. Rav Elyashiv said, there's an that I'm not, that the Rav who's doing it, who knows this halacha, is not going to be selling his kalim. And that the only thing he's going to be selling is the chametz that's dovik on the kalim. So I must tell you, don't mess up and don't write this. But if you did, so Motzei Pesach, you don't have to reaffix the mezuzah and you don't have to toivel the kalim. The next shayla, what's Nagay Motzei Pesach, is what happens. You find out Motzei Pesach, you go to the guy and you tell the guy, no, where's the 190 million shekel? So the guy says, I don't have that kind of money. And the truth is that, I was really doing this whole thing to be nice to you guys because, whenever I buy the chametz, it reminds me of my mother lighting candles on Friday afternoon and crying by when it gets into licht and dust. It reminds me of it, So the mail I do it because it makes me feel about my mother and everything. You're sitting and listening to this. You just realized that the guy that you have been buying that you've been selling the chametz to, he's a non-meyuches. He's a meyuches. He's a non-meyuches guy, but he's a meyuches yid. And so what happens? Chalila, governor, you find out that your guy is chas v'shalom a Jew. What's the did now? Do we say that all of the chametz, all 190 million shekel of this chametz becomes chametz she'aval of a Pesach because it was owned by a Jew? So the Maisa, the Mishabur and Sivkot and Yud Aleph, he brings down in Siman Tov Mem Ches that if a person is not allowed to sell Chalila to a mummer, he's not allowed to sell the chametz to a mummer. He says you're over on lifnei iver if you do, and he says, and if you do, the chametz is now asa b'anon Motzei Pesach. Now there is a Magen Elif in Siman Kuf Zayin that the Magen Elif says that there was no knas on a mummer because the knas was only given as a deterrent to make it that he shouldn't own it. But this guy, this mummer, he's not going to care. So there's no knas that was ever put on him. The knas was only put on from people. Because a from person, if you tell him that after Pesach, you're not going to be able to own it, it's not going to be kedai for him to keep it around. And he won't be from Bal Yerah Bal Yimotzei. But Mashenkin and mummer, what are you going to tell him? If you go and do this and sell and keep the chametz on Pesach and everything, so then Motzei Pesach is going to be us. He doesn't care about Pesach. He doesn't care about Motzei Pesach. That's the Magen Elif. But the Mishabur is not like that. So in our case, that's kumtachais that the chametz after Pesach, if you find out that your guy was a Jew, this chametz is aser bano. The chametz shavel of a Pesach. So here Rabbi say there's a Shalom Meshiv in actually two Shalom Meshivs. There's Dalid Yud. There's in Beis Samech. No, the Meister, the Shalom Meshiv has one side that he to himself has a din of a guy. Interesting tzad. He has a tzad that you can't sell to him. He'll be over on lifnei iver. But he himself does have a din of a goy mamish. And what we say, Afal Pi Shechati Yisrael, is only our yachas to him. But he himself is a guy, and therefore he doesn't have a din of chametz shavel pesach. But that's chedushim. That's chedushim. The mahalach over here at Beis that you have to go with to matter this case, this 190 million shekel case, but the Eved, is that there's a Mishnah Berurah himself over here in Shartzi and Yud Gimel that says, what if you're an oinus gomer? What if I'm an oinus gomer? I tried to sell my chametz and I'm an oinus gomer. The Beis Meir says oinus gomer, it could be that we do not consider that the item should be chametz she'aval of a Pesach. The case of an oinus, we don't care if a person's an oinus, he forgot or something like that. Then person forgot to sell. We had a case here in Ramat Shlomo 3 years ago that the Baal Makolet, he forgot to sell the chametz. He told him to do it. And nobody did it. He was a somewhat of an oinus, but it doesn't matter. They had to burn it on Pesach. I'm sorry, they had to burn it after Pesach. They had to get rid of it after Pesach because it doesn't matter that you're an oinus. But here might be called an oinus gomer. because I did what I was supposed to do. I forgot to check his yichus chart, but I sold the chametz like I'm supposed to do, and I did bittul. Normally, Chazal say don't be saimich on the bittul, so I do bittul and I do mechira. So yeah, what do you want? I'm an oinus gomer. I did the mechira, and it turned out that the fellow was a Jew. So it could be that there'd be a tzad to be makel based on oinus gomer. I had a little tzad to say about an interesting shaila. Maybe it could be toilet. It's quite ironic. There's a very famous shaila that everybody talks about. Rav Moshe talks about it. What happens if you have a goy? What happens if you have a Jew, a non-religious Jew, that sells his chametz? He sells his chametz because he doesn't want the from people to put up signs against him and tell him nobody should buy by his store. So he sells the chametz. Very famous shaila. But he's not listening. He goes on Pesach and he's still eating the chametz and he's still selling chametz. He has a store and he still sells chametz. So are you allowed to saimich on that mechira? Very famous shaila. To make a long story short, Rav Moshe's makel. Rav Moshe says, look, this fellow, he signed a shtar that says he's selling his chametz, and now what's he doing? He's stealing from the guy. That's what he's doing. He's stealing from the guy. Senechanami. He's, it's his avera and fine, but the other stuff in the store is sold. I don't want to get into this shaila now, but that's what Rav Moshe says. Other achreinim argue in Rav Moshe, and they say this like this. They say, what's the whole mechira here, anyways? Some achreinim say the mechira is really harama. You're not really selling 190 million shekel of chametz. So what is it? You're just trying to do a ma'aseh to show that my bittul is real and that I mean it and that I want this out of my rishus. I'm even willing to sell it. So they say that's all that comment that you're a from person and that you will sell it and it's a rama. But if the guy would want to come now and pay me the money, gives him the hate. But if I go and I actually am selling the chametz that I sold, then I'm showing that the whole thing's a joke by me, and then we don't have the gilui. The whole idea is that you're being megale, that you are not interested in this chametz. If I sell chametz that I sold, that shows I am interested in this chametz. So they argue in Rav Moshe. It's a very big fight. Nafkamina, could you go in a store that he sold his chametz for Pesach, but he didn't really care about the mechira? It's a very big fight, and they don't want to go into it. But I was thinking over here, ironically, it could be Rav Moshe won't help us, and the Adarabah, the Machmirim, will help us. Why? According to Rav Moshe, what happened in our case over here? I went and I sold it to this Jew who turns out he was a Jew, right? According to Rav Moshe, too bad. You sold it. It's a mechira. According to Rav Moshe, it's a mechira that's chal. I don't care if you wanted to do it. I don't care if you don't want to do it. It's a mechira that's chal. Knew this guy's a Jew. So if he's a Jew, we have a problem. Chametz shavuot of Pesach. According to the other side, what's the other side? The other side says, what am I doing when I'm selling it? I'm just trying to show I just want this thing out of my rishus. I want it out of my rishus. So maybe you could say it like this. You could say, look, there's an umdana, excuse me. Maybe you could say it like this. There's an umdana that I don't want to sell it to the Jew. I certainly don't want to sell it to the Jew because I don't want to be over on lifnei either. But I am certainly clearly begala that I want it out of my rishus. So that if I'm clearly being megala, I want it out of my rishus. So then maybe even if he is a Jew and I just didn't know it, so then it shows my bittul is real. Why are you doing a mechira? You're trying to show that I mean business when I do the bittul. I mean it. I'm willing to sell it. So those that go with that approach, the machmirim, ironically over here, might be a kula. And this is why many paiskim, when they get this shaila, I mean, Alavai shouldn't be negeya, but many paiskim, when they get this shaila, and it turns out that your guy was a meyuchastik yid, they are going to be mekel, the eved, or other because of Vainis Gomer, other because of the other reason that we said, because you were megala that you wanted out of your shus, and your bittul is a real bittul. Now, Baisai, we're mamish in the final stretch over here of the Seder. We're holding by the nirtzim mamish the chad gadja, Rabbi Isai. Let me just give you a little chad gadja, a little bissel chad gadja. A couple of stories. I see on my clock over here, I have 5 minutes. In these 5 minutes, let me tell you some abissel echad miyadeya, shnai miyadeya. Let me tell you some stories and some riddlech, so you could share it with zevach mishpacha. One story, Rabbi Isai, was with Belzer Rebbe, very interesting ma'isa. The Belzer Rebbe at the Seder, the derech of some Rebbes was that the Bachrim would eat in one room and the Rebbe would eat in a different room. No, the Rebbe came out and he sees there's all the Bachrim and they're drinking the wine and they're eating the matzahs and everything. And he looks in and he sees that they're not doing any aseba. So the Rebbe comes in, what's going on here? Nobody's doing aseba. What's going on? You have to do aseba. And the way it worked was that the Rebbe would do the first part of the Seder in a veinig inside, and then he would come out. So now the Rebbe comes out, he sees that they didn't do a Seba. So the Rebbe tells them they have to do the whole Seder over again, and they have to do again the matzah, and again the Dalit Kaisis. No. So the Rebbe comes, now the Rebbe's sitting there. So someone clapped like this. They said to the Rebbe, how you talking such a thing? We have to redo the matzah, and we have to do the wine. Why? Because we didn't do a Seba. No, but now that the Rebbe is here, so does a person have to be Masiv in front of his Rebbe? He doesn't have to be Masiv in front of his Rebbe. So we're going to go and drink the wine again and eat the matzah again without a Seba? So the Rebbe said, yeah, because before you weren't Yaitse, and in front of the Rebbe, you're not allowed to do a Seba. So it's a Gavaldik riddle. Where do you have a case? Listen to that Meiser by side. Where do you have a case that the fellow didn't do a Seba? And now he tells him, you know what? Because you didn't do a Seba, now you got to eat again without a Seba. That's the case. The case is you aren't Masiv. The Rebbe comes in and yells at you and says you aren't Masiv, and now the Rebbe is there. So in front of the Rebbe, you can't do a Seba, but you got to do the Dalit Kaisis again. Chad Gadya. Let me get weiter. Next, where do you have a case? This Chalila, it shouldn't be Negeya. Chaz v'Chalila. But where do you have a case? Normally, the halacha is on Shabbos. We learned over here by the Aguda, we learned Amir Lakim. No, where do you have a case of where a guy, you're never allowed to tell a guy to put out a fire on Shabbos unless it's Pekuch Nefesh or whatever. But there's a whole Mishnah against the Sugya that if it's a fire, there's a fire and there's no Pekuch Nefesh. But upon him, there's a fire, you're not allowed to tell the guy to put out the fire. No. Where do you have a case that Dafka, you can tell the guy, put out the fire? Normally, you're allowed to tell the guy some type of remiss to put out the fire. But where do you have a case where you can tell the guy that the same house is burning, the house is burning, and you tell the guy, Tony, put out the fire in I don't want to say in my house, in Shlomi's house, right? Where do you have a case? Go put out the fire in Plony's house. Where do you have a case? You're not allowed. Chas v'chalila, but on Shabbos, on Pesach, you'd be allowed. Why? Everybody say, Gavaldik a case. Am I allowed to tell the guy to mow his lawn? I'm allowed to tell a guy to go and do malacha for himself. I can't tell a guy to do malacha for me, but I can tell the guy, go and do malacha for yourself. I see a guy, he needs a shave. Tony, you need a shave. You look already like a from a yid, you know, you need a shave already, right? I'm allowed to tell Tony to shave. So if the Jew sold the chametz to the guy on Erev Pesach, and now his house is burning down. So normally, the Jew can't tell him to put out the fire because he's telling him to put out the fire for his chametz. But Rabbi say, if the Jew's house is burning down and there's goyish chametz inside the house, he can say, Tony, put out the fire, save the chametz of the guy. Because now he's not telling him to put out the fire for the Jew, he's telling him to put out the fire for the guy. So where do you have a case of where normally you're not allowed to tell a guy to put out the fire on the house on Shabbos? But Shabbos, Pesach, you are allowed. The Torah says this is the case if you sold him the chametz. If you sold him the chametz, now you're telling him put out the fire for yourself, Mr. Guy. not for you. And the last thing Rabbi say is where do you have a case of where two people, they bought meat, they bought wine in the same supermarket, the same kosher supermarket, the same kosher meat, the same kosher wine. And this guy, he comes, he eats his kosher meat and yayin today on Chol Hamoed, and he eats it, and we tell him, you get a mitzvah of Simchas Yontif, you get a mitzvah of V'samachta b'chagecha. And the other guy, he's eating the exact same meat and the exact same wine, and we tell him you're getting an Avera, your food is no good, it's tameh and treif, it's no good, but it's the exact same food. And Rabbi says this is not one of those riddles like he made a neder and this and that. No. This is the last page in Chelek in the Mishnah Berurah. In the last page in Chelek in the Mishnah Berurah brings down that a person that he goes and he buys meat and he buys wine, but he doesn't think about the aniyim. He doesn't think about the people that are less fortunate than him. And he goes and he has his meat and his wine. So one guy has meat and wine and he gives money to the aniyim. So then his is a simchas yontev v'samachta b'chagecha. But the andere mensch, he went and he bought meat and he bought the same wine and he didn't care about the aniyim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, your food is tameh. You're not getting the mitzvah b'chal. That's not called a samachta b'chagecha. That's simchas boich. That's simcha of your stomach. Rav Shach Zechron Levracha, he said, why is it the Rebbeinu Shalom? We had to get out of there. We were in the 49th Tumah. We were at the end. Why couldn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How did it happen, Rabbi Yisai? They heard a whole year of makis, of emunah bitachin. And if they would have stayed in Mitzrayim for one more second, they would have fallen into the Memtat Shai, to the Nun Shai Tumah. What happened? They heard of one full year of emunah bitachin. How's it possible? Zoktav Shach says a person can spend the whole entire year talking emunah and bitachin, but if he doesn't go out the next day and lemaisa can talk emunah bitachin, but he doesn't start. But the next day he doesn't go out with the blat gemara. He did the whole day with emunah bitachin, but if he doesn't go out, so then he's going to fall into the nun shai tumah. That's what we did, Rabbi Yisai, over here. But the good is Israel, you went and you spent the seder with emunah and bitachin, and you show how we're starting our sphere sa'ima. Our sphere sa'ima, we're going right into it, not just in the talking about emunah. We're going right into the learning, getting ourselves ready for Matan Torah. Halavai, this should be a schus for us and for ganz Klal Yisrael. And that next year, Mitzvah Hashem will mekayim the Leil Seder Tzizam in Yerushalayim, Kodesh Lashana, Yerushalayim Abnuya.